This is the Interested Interview. I'm your host, JJ Clarke, and today we're going to be talking about baby steps to crime, how the young are recruited into a life of crime. And to help me with that is crime editor with the Irish Sun and author, Stephen Breen. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So, Stephen, firstly, can you tell us, when are kids typically, what age are they recruited into criminal gangs in Ireland?
Well, in recent years, JJ, we've written a number of stories regarding young people who have been attracted into the realms of organised crime, and only recently, in relation to the killing of Cian Mulready Woods in Drogheda, that horrific killing, we saw the Gardaí speaking at different and various community forums there, and we interviewed a few members of the Gardaí, and speaking to them, they were concerned that kids as young as 12 and 13 were being attracted to organised crime gangs. They were being recruited by criminals who are engaged in drug dealing and also weapons importation. And the kids were being offered small amounts of money, €100, €200 to start with, doing runners, and for keeping an eye out, if there was a Garda presence in the area. And it was quite concerning that there were kids from very deprived backgrounds, kids from dysfunctional families, and there was a concern there that once they're into the realms of the organised crime gangs at 12 or 13, then that progression continues to more violent forms of crime, such as intimidation of rival teenagers who owe money for drugs, and also collecting drugs and moving them around, and then as they get a bit older, they go into intimidation. But it was quite concerning that kids from that age were being groomed, essentially, for a life of organised crime, because they see some of their peers around them who are 15, 16, and they have lots of money. They have the designer clothing, the Gucci clothing, the trainers, the fancy phones, and so there is an attraction there, because this is what they want, a life that promises them huge amounts of money,
Right,
and a degree of status as well among their peers.
Right, and I suppose you mentioned there the like €100 for an 11 or 12-year-old is an immense amount of money. It's not a insubstantial amount of money. And I suppose within the crime gang, is there an emphasis then on the recruitment process? So when you say someone's recruiting younger members to do runners, and I suppose whistling, and when a squad car is in the area, or calling on their phone, or taking pictures, or whatever.
Yeah, I think it's all part of a process, and it's all part of a plan that criminal gangs have, because ultimately their main objective is to make money, and they do that through drugs and intimidation and other forms of crime. So for me, they target young people, and maybe young people who they see as vulnerable, young people whose perhaps their parents have addiction problems, young people who have no interest in education. And they deliberately target these kids, and they offer them the money when they're teenagers. But then it's all about progression as well. So if it starts off with perhaps being a runner, it starts off with keeping an eye out for the Gardaí coming into an area, offering cash to them, and the money builds up, and the kids start enjoying this life. But then as they get a bit older, say 16, 17, it's different forms of crime where the kids are then asked to perhaps hold a gun. They're perhaps asked to intimidate a local family, throw petrol bombs at a house of someone who owes money perhaps. And then as they get a bit older, it can lead to more serious forms of crime, such as committing murder. And we've seen that even if you look at the Crumlin and Drimna feud. Declan Gavin was only 21 when he was killed, and over the course of a 15-year period from 2001, 16 young men lost their lives. But at the start of this feud, when people were being killed, it was all young men, and they were people who, when they were younger in their teenage years, were perhaps arrested by the Gardaí for public order incidents and for lesser offences. But you could see there that there was a progression for them to get involved in more serious forms of crime, and I think it's a deliberate ploy by criminal gangs, to attract young people who perhaps don't see a future for themselves. There's no educational objectives there, so it's a deliberate attempt by serious criminals who are a bit older to recruit those to do work that they wouldn't necessarily do themselves because of the fear they have of going to prison. And it is all about money for the criminal godfathers. That's a fact.
And just if we linger there on, I suppose, just that element of you get to 15, 16 and you're in a criminal gang. You've been a runner for a while and you're kind of leveling up and you've kind of shown that, you can do the work and that I suppose that they can trust you. And then you talk about holding. And I suppose this is a device used by crime gangs to great effect. They make you hold a substantial amount of drugs or a gun or something else, and you're party to a big crime, so that if you want to sort your life out and straighten, go on the straight and narrow, they'll be like, we have this on you, this is what you did. I suppose, is that a common feature, or is that kind of played up by movies and TV shows?
No, it is a common feature. I think, looking at the various forms of criminality that we see in our society now, where you do have criminal gangs who have these young members, young guys in their ranks. It starts from a young age and then it does progress, but they have a hold on you. Obviously they can start by offering you €100, €200, but as you get older into your later teenage years, that figure increases, and the trust element is there as well. But there's also a fear element too, because these young guys who have been used to having this money among their peers and this status within in their groups, they want to hold on to that, and they are willing, at what we've seen, to do things that maybe other teenagers wouldn't do, and they see themselves as the big man in terms of their involvement in crime. They want to be the gangster. They like the bling. They like the designer clothing. The lavish lifestyle. But once the godfathers get their claws into young people, it's very hard for them to break out of that cycle. And in very normal cases, it's a case of where you have a young man either going to prison or ended up dead. And if we look at Kulak, for example, the feud there, all young men have been shot dead there. People in their, one's a teenager, others in their early 20s. So it must be very hard for someone who's sucked into a world of organised crime to get out of that, because you either end up dead by your rivals, or the people who employ you. They rule their gangs through intimidation and fear, and obviously they don't care about the people they recruit, so they would have no problem in telling a young person, if you don't do this job, we're going to burn your family house down, we're going to target your friends, we're going to target your relatives. So it's all about coercion and control, in my opinion.
Yeah, particularly young lads. You keep saying young men and young lads, and like it skews really heavily male, and I suppose the kind of kids you see hanging around outside, shops, and they're on their own, and they would be particularly vulnerable. And I suppose, have these kids, offended already? Is it a case where you have a juvenile misdemeanor or someone who's offended already for graffiti or vandalism, and then they like pop up on the radars of these recruiters? Is that how it happens?
Well, it is. I mean, there are kids, if they see someone, say, who's 13 or 14 and they commit like a public order offence or vandalism or a minor assault, and they're given warnings or cautions by the Gardaí, then they are people who are deliberately targeted by organised criminal gangs, because they see them in the community, and they see that these people are a perfect opportunity for them to be recruited, and if they are perhaps convicted from a young age, the criminal godfathers would often say, "Look, here you go. Look, you don't have much of a future. You're not going to go to school. They have no interest in going to school. It's about music. It's about clothing. It's about hanging around street corners, and having no any employment prospects." So they are deliberately targeted. So they are, and they do face a very uncertain future. So for them, it's all about status and about power and about money at the end of the day.
Right, and I suppose there's a severe focus on short-term outcomes, like get rich fast, and one day I'm going to get out of it, and I'm only doing this, to get the money, and I suppose in that sense, when does drugs come into the picture? am I way off here when I say like they're given drugs to be more easily controlled? You're part of the group. Marijuana is in the mix there. So is alcohol. Is that a thing? Or is it not?
Well, I think a feature of organised crime that we've seen in recent years, that young men and others who are associated with organised crime, you often see them on social media, like Facebook, for example. Posting photographs of them smoking a joint, photographs of them enjoying the party lifestyle from a very young age. So,
Mm.
of course, drugs and alcohol play a feature in their lifestyles, and it's all about them showcasing, this is the life that they lead. It's the party life. They're cool. They've no interest in any educational attainment, or perhaps moving forward in different realms, whatever that may be. But there's no question that drugs and alcohol do play a feature. I think that's another way for criminal gangs to control young people as well, to offer them this lifestyle where they do have cash available to buy the drugs, to buy alcohol, and to enjoy the nightclub lifestyle. And it's unfortunate, but it is a reality. And young people, I think maybe in socially deprived areas, don't see a future for themselves, and that's all they seem to be interested in, is going out the weekend with their pals and drinking. But because they're connected and have associations to a criminal gang, I think John O'Keefe, a criminologist, who often referred to as young people having a master status within their communities, and if they get labelled different names for so long, they obviously
Embody those.
appreciate this and continue with what they've been doing in terms of crime.
It's very interesting to me to think about, obviously in an altered state, it's obviously easier to rob a bank if someone is drunk, or is hyped up on drugs or something like that. There's a like it disinhibits the criminal to such an effect that they don't see what's happening as a reality, and so they can just kind of go in there and not have that fear of getting arrested. And I'm sort of interested in the fact that, how are the police seen in this culture, in this, I suppose, space?
Yeah, but the Gardaí and the law enforcement are seen as the enemy in many communities of those involved, especially from those involved in organised crime. But it's also worth pointing out that there are very many programs taking place between the Gardaí and other local community groups, where the Gardaí would go to schools, they would go to have meetings with community representatives and try and explain and offer support to young people who feel affected by crime. I know in Drogheda, for example, in the middle of the Drogheda feud, the Gardaí had an open door policy there, where any young person or their family members who felt intimidated, they were being threatened by criminals, or even those who were involved in organised crime for the feuding gangs, there was a way out for them, that the state did offer support to them. But I think that is important. I know when I've been to court covering different cases, you often hear of young guys who were before the courts referring to the Gardaí as rats and pigs, having a real disdain towards the Gardaí, because ultimately the Gardaí are the people who will bring these people before the court and prosecute them. But there's definitely a macho culture there as well. Maybe that's to do with social media as well, where you have young people who aren't afraid to get involved in organised crime and aren't afraid of the consequences. And even when we see, young men taking up a gun from a young age, and we look at someone like Freddie Thompson, who's nearly 40 now, he got involved in organised crime from a very young age, but there was a progression there from someone from public order to fights in schools to intimidation of locals to ultimately murder. So we can see a progression there, but I think the Gardaí face a difficult task, but it's also all about engagement and community representatives and working together, and the state as well, providing perhaps different courses that young kids can avail of. And if a teenager who's 16, 17 does see one of their peers driving around in a naughty car, they're saying to themselves, "Oh God, that's what I would like. That's what I would want." But ultimately, that can only last for so long, because they either end up dead or in prison, and that's the reality. There is no longevity in terms of organised crime.
And it occurs to me that there's no in these areas there's no access, or I suppose there's no, when if I'm in that area and I'm an 8-year-old boy and I look around, it's only the only role models are athletes and criminals. As in, is that a fair statement or is that unfair? Is that like,
I'm not sure. It's just I think that obviously it's great to have athletes, boxers, footballers, any type of sport from different working class areas who are role models. But you can also have politicians there, other people, teachers, people who get involved in the law as well, lawyers, solicitors.
Yeah,
Who
I
are,
mean, in terms of visibility, as in, like, because
yes.
they're so visible. I don't mean it that they're not there, but I mean in terms of visibility, they're very visible, aren't they?
Well, they are visible, but I think it's also reassuring as well for the public and for parents of young people when they see, for example, the Criminal Assets Bureau seizing assets and watches and clothing, designer handbags from young criminals as well. So that sends out a message too. But there's no question that there are young people who have no interest in education and are attracted by organised crime, despite the pitfalls. I mean, if we look at the Kinahan Hutchfield, look at the amount of men that are now in prison in relation to that feud. But people do see that young men are being killed, and I think it's the smart ones, smart young people who are involved in organised crime, and if they can see that there's no way out for them, that there's no way it's going to end well, then it's a way they have to take the necessary steps to try and do everything they can to move away from that organisation that they're involved in. But and we often see young families moving to different parts of Ireland and indeed to the UK to try and escape a life of crime.
And in that same vein, when you look at people trying to move away that were formerly, intimidators, or, drug pushers, or, sellers or wholesalers, how does that work out typically? Like, is it a, fairy tale of New York thing where they can actually ride off into the sunset and they can get away with it? Or is there an indentured service there that, people above don't like it and you're not leaving and you have to stay?
No, well, obviously there's people that are often terrified and people are afraid of the consequences if someone chooses to leave an organised criminal gang, especially a young person. But it has been happening quite frequently, especially in Drogheda, where families have been going to the Gardaí. They have been getting assistance, monetary assistance to leave Ireland to go to the UK. So obviously there'll always be a certain degree of concern there, but I think it's important that there is help out there. It is available. The Witness Protection Program as well. I spoke to someone who was in that program there recently, and they were telling me it was the best thing they ever did was to get involved in this and to get away from a life of crime, because obviously there will be upheaval in their lives when they choose to leave an organised gang, and they do manage to get away from it all. But it's either that's a lot better than perhaps staying within the ranks of an organised criminal gang and ending up in prison or ending up dead. So there is concern there, but there is support and people are availing of it.
It's great to hear that that's working out in Ireland. In terms of within Ireland and over your journalistic career, looking at the commonalities in different gang cultures, whether it be in Drogheda or in Dublin or wherever in Limerick in Ireland, what are the common features that you see? Is it socioeconomics? Is it access to a larger European market that they're getting the drugs in? Is it always drugs, or is it turf related? What are the commonalities there that you see time and time again? And you're like, well, this is Groundhog Day in a way.
Well, look, there are a lot of similarities. Look, if you look, for example, at the murder of Lyra McKee in Derry last year, okay, that's in the northern part of our island, but the person suspected of murdering her is an 18-year-old, so it is. And you've other young men in Limerick getting involved in organised crime, in Dublin, in Sligo, in Galway, wherever, in Cork. There is a commonality there, a common theme, and that would be young men from socially deprived backgrounds with little or no interest in education, from dysfunctional families, from deprived areas, who they would see that there is no future for them. It doesn't matter if it's Dublin or if it's Cork or Limerick or anywhere. You can see that trend across the whole island. so you can, where young men are getting involved in organised crime, and they're also committing serious crimes like the murder of Lyra McKee. And then we look at the consequences of organised crime, especially with Keane Mulready Woods. I think he was someone who was vulnerable. He was someone who was probably groomed by very dangerous criminals in the Drogheda area to get involved in organised crime because he didn't have too many opportunities in socially deprived areas and where he lived. So you do have a process there, and you can see it across the board in the number of arrests that have been made and the different backgrounds from young men who've been arrested for serious crimes, whether it's drugs or possessing weapons or indeed murder. And another example is the killing of Lorcan O'Reilly. You have a 15-year-old who was convicted of that. A totally innocent guy, 21, was stabbed in Halloween, and that young individual had connections to the Kinahan cartel. So, you can see that even from that young age, there are connections to organised crime, and a lot of these young men look up to people who are involved in organised crime, and that's just across the board. So, but there is, without question, a common theme and a trend there of the types of people that are involved in organised crime across Ireland.
I also find it quite graphic is this new trend of criminal gangs being unbelievably brutal, unbelievably ruthless, and it's where reality imitates fiction. So they see stuff on Narcos or on The Godfather, and then it plays out on streets in Ireland.
It does. I mean, there's been so many barbaric incidents over the years here in Ireland, going back 20, 30 years, and I suppose it is very similar to what we see on the TV screen. We look at the love-hate drama that we had on a few years ago. It was very similar to what was going on in the streets, and it is very concerning that there seems to be no support for human life, no regard for human life, where organised criminals, because of the nature of their criminal activity, are prepared to abduct a 17-year-old teenager like Keane Mulready Woods and dismember him and murder him in a brutal fashion. It's happened throughout the years. We see a teenager like Mario Rostas, just 18, who came to Ireland, was abducted, shot dead, and buried in a shallow grave up the Dublin mountains. So the level of depravity has been certainly increasing in recent years. And of course, we had the famous quote going back from Larry Dunn in relation to, if you think we're bad, wait you see what's coming next. And the levels of violence and the propensity for violence, in my opinion, have definitely increased over the years. And those involved in organised crime aren't afraid to use a gun on a busy street in broad daylight. It's a miracle more innocent people haven't been killed. We look at Martin O'Rourke, 24 years of age, shot dead in broad daylight in Sheriff Street after a gunman was targeting someone else in relation to the Kinahan Hutch feud. So innocent lives are being lost as well. And we go back, Anthony Campbell, a plumber, shot dead just because he's a witness to the murder of Marlow Hyland. So it does happen, and I've noted it will continue to happen because these criminal gangs just don't care, and they don't care about anyone who gets in their way.
The increased propensity for violence and more brutal acts and more public acts is a kind of desensitization process. It's kind of like a leveling up. How well does it map to a military structure, or would you compare it to a different structure, criminal gangs in Ireland?
Well, it's funny you should mention that, JJ, because if you only just earlier this month, the Special Criminal Court was dealing with a case of a plot to kill Jerry Hutch's brother, Patsy. And during the court proceedings, it was suggested in court, and it was for one of the first times, really, it suggested that the Kinahan organised crime gang were involved in execution-style murders, and they operated in a cell-like structure, and that was a cell-like structure that was previously adopted by the Provisional IRA during the conflict in the north, where they had what was known as active service units, where you had from different areas of individuals who were engaged, they said military actions against the British Army and others. But then it's a similar strategy that's been adopted by organised crime gangs like the Kinahan Cartel, where you have, for example, say in North Dublin, you have a cell, a group of individuals who have a leader and who you have people below them, and each of those individuals are given different orders and different instructions of a criminal enterprise that they're involved in. But ultimately, the orders from that cell are coming from overseas, so where it would come from a senior member of the Kinahan gang. And I think that's the way the criminal gangs work, where they do have people they can trust. They have people operating in different areas, but they may all be working for the one organisation, such as the Kinahan gang, but each cell, as they're called, won't know what the other cell are doing. So it really is a very military-style operation that they run. They have the access to weapons. We've written before about some of these serious criminals going to weapons training courses overseas, and indeed when my colleague and I, Owen Collin, were writing the book on the Kinahan Cartel, we wrote about how they'd undergone surveillance training and specialist training from specialist forces from Eastern Europe. And it's all about like a strategy that they have, like a military-style operation as they try to stay one step ahead of the law. But there's no question that because it is organised, they all have specific jobs to do. They all have specific roles. So that's where the organisation element of it is very important to the proper functioning of an organised gang.
Is there any sort of silver lining or areas in the last 5 years, or I suppose when Drew Harris came in, or anything like that, a policing element or a new program that's been brought in that you see as something promising for the future? Like, is there, or is it, as in, do you have any thoughts on is there any end in sight in this, or is it just going to be the next gang and the next gang? Or am I going to be talking about, another gang in the next 10 years? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, unfortunately, when a criminal gang is dismantled by the Gardaí, and the main priorities for the Gardaí would be to dismantle criminal gangs who pose the biggest threat to society, and that's those engaged in drugs and also who are taking lives, because obviously saving lives, it's of paramount importance to the Gardaí. But they do have more. We've seen more youth diversion programs, more of an emphasis now on community policing within disadvantaged areas. So I think that's a positive step that the Gardaí have undertaken. But there's no question. Look, I spoke to various community representatives in the North Inner City who are doing excellent work in trying to have outreach programs for young people, trying to keep them off the streets. But it always comes down to funding, and there's no question that community groups and organisations across the whole island could do with more funding to perhaps give a bit more hope and a bit more support to communities who have concerns about young people becoming involved in crime. But, we see it there's always a cycle. When you have a criminal gang who have been dismantled by the Gardaí, there's always someone else, there's one or two individuals who want to step into the vacuum, and I don't think that's going to change. We're always going to have crime, but it's about trying to reduce the limit. And under Drew Harris's watch, there's no question that there has been a very big increase in relation to the number of arrests, number of seizures, different programs taking place. So I think once after we came out of recession many years ago, the proper funding was put in place for the Gardaí. You look at the Drugs and Organised Crime Bureau, the work that they're doing. I think once the funding is in place, it makes it much easier for the Gardaí and society as a whole to try and disrupt criminal activity. But I think once it's people are brought before the courts, once they go to prison, there will always be someone else who will step in, and I think you'll see that as a trend anywhere in the world.
Yeah, it's almost like the Hydra, that there's you create a vacuum and then another head pops up. Anyway, Stephen, we'll leave it there. Stephen Breen, crime editor with the Irish Sun and author. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, JJ.